The first gunshot sent shockwaves through the packed sanctuary. Screams echoed, bodies hit the floor, and the air filled with sheer panic. A second shot followed. Then silence. At the front of the church, a man lay motionless, blood pooling beneath him. The congregation remained frozen, too stunned to react. No one could process what had just happened. The shooter? His own mother? She didn't run. She didn't resist. She stood there, the gun still in her hands, her expression unreadable. But this wasn't just an act of rage. It wasn't a moment of madness. It was the result of a secret so vile, so unimaginable, that a mother saw only one way to erase it. By the time the authorities arrived, the truth was already beginning to unravel, and what they would uncover in the days that followed would shake the very foundation of faith, family, and morality itself. Some crimes are fueled by hatred, others by revenge. But this was something far worse. Welcome to True Crimes Corner, where we uncover the most shocking and untold cases. Some crimes leave behind more than just victims. They leave behind questions that demand answers. If you believe in exposing the truth and bringing awareness to stories that should never be forgotten, make sure to subscribe and share this video. Because sometimes, the most unthinkable crimes happen where you least expect them. To his congregation, Hardin Williams was the perfect pastor. He was charismatic, devoted, and deeply respected. He spoke with conviction, commanding attention every time he stepped behind the pulpit. People believed in him. They trusted him. He was seen as a leader, a mentor, and a man of unwavering faith. But Hardin had been living a lie his entire life. From a young age, he knew he was different. Raised in a strict Christian household, he learned early that certain desires were not just frowned upon. They were condemned. He buried them, prayed against them, convinced himself that if he dedicated his life to God, he could suppress the feelings that had haunted him since high school. He excelled in everything he did. A top student, an athlete, a natural leader. He played basketball, studied computer science, and carried himself with the confidence of someone destined for greatness. But despite his achievements, there was one expectation he couldn't escape: the church. His father, Bob Williams, had spent decades building the ministry, and it was understood that one day Hardin would take over. When the time came, there was only one condition placed upon him: a pastor must be married. The elders of the church believed that a wife would keep him grounded, eliminate temptation, and ensure he lived up to the role expected of him. So he did what was required. Natasha Desmond became Natasha Williams, the woman everyone believed was his perfect match. She was beautiful, devoted, and deeply in love with him. To her, their marriage was real. To Hardin, it was just another part of the performance. For years, he played the role flawlessly. He preached about righteousness. He guided young men in the congregation. He built a reputation as a man of integrity, a husband, a father, a spiritual leader. But the truth never disappeared. It waited, always beneath the surface, growing stronger, and soon the mask he had worn for so long would begin to crack. From the outside, Hardin and Natasha Williams were admired, respected, even envied. Natasha was everything a pastor's wife was expected to be: elegant, supportive, devoted to both her husband and the church. Together they looked like the embodiment of faith and commitment. But the truth was far different. Hardin's love for Natasha was never real. To him, she was a necessity, an expectation, a requirement he had to meet to maintain the image of a godly man. Their courtship had been fast, almost transactional. The elders encouraged it, and Hardin, knowing it would solidify his position in the church, went along with it. For Natasha, it was a dream come true. She had loved Hardin for years, admiring him from the congregation long before they were married. When he proposed, She believed it was a sign from God. She thought she had found a partner, a protector, a soulmate. In the beginning, everything seemed perfect. They prayed together, attended church events hand in hand, and soon welcomed their daughter, Celine. But Natasha started noticing the cracks. Hardin was distant. Their intimacy faded slowly. He made excuses for the times he slept off, or just wasn't interested. Then came the miscarriages. Twice, she became pregnant again. Twice, she lost the babies. She was devastated. But Hardin's reaction was strange. He showed no real grief, no sadness. If anything, he seemed relieved. That was the moment Natasha realized something was wrong. She tried to ignore it, convincing herself that every marriage had struggles, that Hardin was just under pressure. She threw herself deeper into church activities, into motherhood, into being the perfect pastor's wife. But deep down, she couldn't shake the feeling that something about her husband was missing. And soon, she would find out exactly what it was. At first, it was just thoughts, moments of weakness he repented for in prayer, pleading for deliverance. But as time passed, thoughts weren't enough. Temptation became action. It started subtly. Hardin positioned himself as a mentor to young men in the church, particularly those who were lost, struggling, or seeking guidance. He offered counsel, comfort, spiritual advice. He built their trust, made them feel special, chosen. Then, slowly, the lines blurred. Late-night private meetings, invitations to special prayer sessions, conversations that became too personal, too intimate. For the boys who found themselves drawn into his world, it was confusing. He was their pastor, their spiritual father, the man they admired. How could something feel so wrong, yet be presented as something holy? Hardin knew how to manipulate. He framed everything as God's special bond, twisting faith to justify what he was doing. He reassured them that this was their secret, that they were chosen, that no one else would understand. For a while, it worked. No one suspected a thing. His image remained intact, his reputation untarnished. But the expected happened. One of the boys, a teenager from a deeply religious family, began to feel suffocated by guilt. He had believed Hardin's words at first, had convinced himself that their relationship was something sacred. But now he saw it for what it was. He couldn't stay silent. So he told his father. The confession set off a storm that no one was prepared for. The boy's father, a deeply religious man and longtime church member, had been shaken to his core by what his son revealed. At first, denial took over. He wanted to believe there had been some misunderstanding, that his son had misinterpreted something. But the details were too specific, too disturbing. His son wasn't lying. Conflicted and unsure of what to do, he took the information to Bob Williams, Hardin's father. Bob listened carefully, showing no reaction at first. He had spent decades building his church, raising his son to carry on his legacy. Now, in a single conversation, everything he had worked for was being threatened. He sat in silence as the boy's father explained what had happened, the way Hardin had manipulated and taken advantage of his position. When the conversation ended, Bob assured the man that he would handle it. That night, Bob sat alone, staring at the walls of his home, his mind racing. If this were true, it would mean he had failed, not just as a father, but as a spiritual leader. The weight of the accusation was unbearable. Still, there was no proof, only the word of one young man. Eventually, he told Carrie. His wife's reaction was immediate and unwavering. She refused to believe it. She dismissed the accusation, convinced that this was nothing more than an attempt to destroy Hardin's reputation. She argued that people had always sought to bring men of God down, and this was no different. There was no hesitation in her voice, No room for doubt. Bob, however, wasn't sure. Something about the accusation lingered in his mind. But Carrie was adamant. She had no intention of allowing their family to be torn apart by what she saw as baseless claims. She shut down the conversation before it could go any further. From that moment on, Bob never spoke of it again. The tension in the Williams household had been building for weeks, but no one spoke about it. Bob carried the weight of what he had been told, but with no proof and his wife's unwavering faith in their son, he forced himself to push it aside. Hardin remained composed, never showing the slightest sign of guilt or concern. If the accusation had reached him, he gave no indication. Then came the weekend that shattered everything. The church's youth members had been scheduled for an out-of-town retreat, an annual tradition that Hardin had always attended. But this year, he chose to stay behind. His reason was simple. He needed to prepare for Sunday's sermon. It was an excuse that raised no suspicion. After all, he was the head of the church, and no one questioned his devotion to his duties. On that same Friday evening, Bob called Hardin. He wanted to speak with him before Sunday, to discuss a few concerns he had about the state of the church. It wasn't unusual for them to have private conversations about leadership matters, and Hardin agreed without hesitation. But after ending the call, a different thought entered Hardin's mind. A thought so dark, so unthinkable, that it should have made him pause. Instead, he acted on it. He left his home, drove to a nearby pharmacy, and purchased a sedative. It wasn't something he had planned, but now that the idea had taken root, it felt like the only course of action. He couldn't risk his father asking the wrong questions or looking too deeply into things that weren't meant to be uncovered. By the time Bob arrived at Hardin's office, everything was already set in motion. The conversation started normally. Bob sat across from his son, discussing the usual church matters, unaware that the drink placed in front of him had been tampered with. As the minutes passed, he began to feel the effects. His thoughts became sluggish, his body heavy, his vision blurred. Hardin watched without emotion as his father struggled to stay alert. Then, as Bob's body weakened, Hardin did something that would forever stain his soul. He acted on the thought that should have never existed. What happened in that office was something no son should ever inflict upon his father. It was a crime that crossed every moral, ethical, and spiritual boundary. But for Hardin, it was simply another sin to be buried. What he didn't know was that someone else had already arrived at the church. His mother. Carrie Williams had not planned on visiting the church that night. She had driven her husband there, assuming his conversation with Hardin would be brief. But as she parked outside, she was stopped by a longtime church member. What started as a simple greeting turned into a prolonged discussion. The conversation stretched, minutes turning into an hour, as they reminisced about the early days of the church, the sacrifices made to build it, and the future they hoped to see. Unbeknownst to her, inside the building, something unimaginable was happening. By the time Carrie ended her conversation and made her way toward Hardin's office, she expected nothing unusual. She knocked once, then turned the handle, stepping inside without waiting for an answer. What she saw stopped her heart. Her husband was slumped over the desk, motionless, drugged beyond comprehension, and behind him, her son, her firstborn, her pride, was doing something that no mother should ever witness. For a moment she couldn't move. The image in front of her didn't make sense. It couldn't be real. But then Hardin turned, and their eyes met. He didn't panic. He didn't scramble to explain. He simply walked past her as if nothing had happened. The air in the room felt suffocating. Her body trembled as she rushed toward her husband, shaking him, calling his name. He was breathing but barely responsive. His eyes fluttered open for a second before rolling back, lost in the effects of the sedative. Carrie stayed there for hours, her hands gripping his lifeless ones, unable to process what had just happened. When he finally woke up, he had no memory of anything. He was disoriented, confused, weak. She helped him to his feet, guiding him towards the car, saying nothing about what she had seen. But inside, something in her had already broken. As they drove home, her husband unaware, Carrie sat in silence, staring at the road ahead. She knew what she had to do. No one brought shame to the name of the Lord. No one. The moment they arrived home, she helped her husband inside, guiding him to bed, watching as he drifted into a deep, uneasy sleep. She stood there for a long time, staring at him, knowing that when he woke up in the morning, his world would still be intact. He had been spared the knowledge of what had truly happened. But she hadn't. She sat alone in the darkened living room, the weight of the night pressing down on her. The horror of what she had seen replayed in her mind in a relentless loop. Her son, her own flesh and blood, had done the unthinkable. It wasn't just a sin, it wasn't just a crime. It was something beyond redemption. Carrie had always believed in forgiveness. She had preached it, lived by it, taught it to others. But some things, she realized, could not be forgiven. Some things demanded justice. She thought about confronting Hardin, about forcing him to admit what he had done. But then what? Would he repent? Would he stop? Would he even feel guilt? He had walked past her like nothing had happened. He was beyond saving. As the hours passed, Carrie barely moved. She prayed, not for clarity, not for strength, but for resolve. What had to be done was already clear. The church would gather in a few hours. Her son would stand at the pulpit, preaching about righteousness, about salvation, about God's mercy. She couldn't allow that to happen. Carrie rose from her chair, her movements slow but deliberate. She walked to the bedroom she and Bob had shared for decades, opened the dresser drawer, and pulled out the small handgun they had owned for years. It had never been fired outside of a shooting range, but that would change soon. She sat back down, the gun resting in her lap, her eyes unblinking as the first hints of dawn crept through the windows. She was ready. The church was packed. The choir had finished their opening hymns. The congregation settled into their seats, waiting for the message. Hardin Williams stood behind the pulpit, his voice steady, delivering a sermon on forgiveness. Carrie sat near the back, silent, unmoving. The weight of the gun inside her purse felt heavier than anything she had ever carried, but she had no hesitation, no second thoughts. Hardin spoke with conviction, his words powerful, his presence commanding. To everyone in the room, he was a man of God, a leader, an example. But Carrie knew the truth. The hypocrisy of his sermon burned in her ears. She watched as people nodded, whispered, "Amen," hanging on to his every word. They saw a preacher. She saw a monster. Hardin had spent years deceiving everyone. He had deceived the congregation. He had deceived his wife. He had deceived his father. But worst of all, he had deceived God. And no one was going to stop him, except her. Carrie stood up. Her movements were calm, controlled. She walked down the aisle slowly, her eyes locked onto her son. Hardin continued preaching, unaware, his voice rising in intensity. Then came the first gunshot. The sound exploded through the sanctuary, deafening, shattering the peaceful atmosphere in an instant. Screams filled the air. People dropped to the floor. The second shot followed. Hardin staggered, his body jerking from the impact. Blood bloomed across his pristine white robe. His expression for the first time was one of pure shock. He stumbled back, his legs giving out beneath him. He collapsed at the base of the pulpit, The congregation was frozen, too horrified to move. The woman holding the gun didn't run, didn't scream, didn't break down. She simply lowered the weapon, standing motionless as chaos erupted around her. When the first officers arrived minutes later, Carrie was exactly where she had been standing, her eyes still locked onto her son's lifeless body. She didn't resist when they took the gun from her hands. She didn't fight when they placed the cuffs around her wrists. As she was led out of the church, past the terrified congregation, past the people she had once worshipped with, she spoke only one sentence. "No one disgraces the name of the Lord." Carrie Williams was taken into custody without resistance. She didn't ask for a lawyer, didn't demand to make a statement. She sat in the interrogation room, hands folded neatly in her lap, eyes unblinking as officers moved around her. At the church, detectives were met with chaos. Witnesses were shaken, many still in tears, trying to comprehend what they had just seen. The initial assumption was that this was a personal dispute, a mother snapping in a moment of rage, but the truth was far worse than anyone could have imagined. As investigators began piecing things together, details surfaced that turned this case from a shocking church shooting into something much darker. Bob Williams, still disoriented from the effects of the sedative, was questioned about his son. At first he struggled to process what had happened, but as the questions became more specific, memories began surfacing. The sudden drowsiness in Hardin's office, the way Carrie had helped him home, shaken but silent. He couldn't understand what it all meant, until detectives began pushing further. Natasha Williams was also questioned. At first, she was simply a grieving widow, struggling to make sense of what had happened. But when asked about her marriage, her husband's behavior, and the accusations that had started surfacing, cracks began to show. Then came the real turning point. One of the young men Hardin had lured into his web finally came forward. The same boy who had confessed to his father. The same confession that Bob had once ignored. But this time, it wasn't just whispered accusations. He told everything. The manipulation, the trust Hardin had built, the way he had twisted faith into something sinister. More details began emerging. More young men, some still in the church, others who had left, came forward with similar accounts. Hardin's predatory actions had been hidden under a carefully crafted image of holiness and authority. As the investigation deepened, evidence from Hardin's office revealed more disturbing details. The prescription bottle for sedatives, proving Bob had been drugged. His personal journal, where investigators found twisted justifications for his actions. Carrie never spoke in detail about what she had seen that night, but investigators knew the truth now. She had walked in on something so vile, so incomprehensible, that her mind had only one solution. By the time the full picture was revealed, the congregation, once devoted to Hardin, was left in shock. Their beloved pastor wasn't a martyr. He was a monster hiding behind the pulpit. Carrie Williams never denied what she had done. During her trial, she sat expressionless as prosecutors detailed the execution of her son in front of hundreds of witnesses. There was no attempt to plead insanity, no effort to justify her actions in the eyes of the law. When asked if she regretted it, she simply responded, "No one disgraces the name of the Lord." The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours. She was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Some saw her as a murderer. Others, especially those who later learned the truth about her son, viewed her as a woman who had done what no one else had the strength to do. Bob Williams never fully recovered. The man who had once led his church with unwavering conviction now carried the weight of guilt and shame. He had ignored the warning signs, dismissed concerns, and refused to believe the possibility that his son could be anything less than the man he had raised him to be. His health deteriorated rapidly after the trial, and within a year he was gone, a heart attack in his sleep. Natasha Williams vanished from public view after the truth unraveled. The grief of losing her husband was overshadowed by the realization that she had never truly known him. Everything had been a lie. The marriage, the family, the image they projected. None of it had been real. She left the city with her daughter Celine, changing their last name and severing all ties with the church and its past. The congregation fractured. Some refused to believe the accusations against Hardin, convinced that the media had twisted the story. Others felt betrayed, disgusted that they had spent years looking up to a man who had been living in deception. Attendance dropped. Eventually, the church closed its doors for good. Carrie's case remained one of the most shocking and disturbing acts of family violence in recent history. But long after the headlines faded, one truth remained. This wasn't just a story of murder. It was a story of secrets, faith, and the darkness that can hide behind righteousness. Faith can be a powerful thing, but what happens when it's built on lies? Carrie Williams believed she was delivering justice, but in the end, this case left only destruction in its wake. If stories like this need to be told, if these truths should never be forgotten, then like this video, share it, and subscribe to True Crimes Corner, because the worst crimes don't just happen in the shadows, they happen where no one expects.